Thanks everybody for coming to what is the last of our spring 2021, winter and spring 2021 meetings of the Harvard Northeastern Misinformation Speaker Series. I'm Matt Baum. I'm a professor at the Kennedy School and affiliated with the Shorenstein Center, which is the other co-sponsor. Today, we're really happy to have Professor Rasmus Kleis Nielsen joining us. He's the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He's also a professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. Prior to that, he was director of research at the Reuters Institute and editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics, which, when I first got to Harvard, was actually at the Shorenstein Center before it became independent. His work focuses on changes in the news media, on political communication, and the role of digital technologies in both contexts. He's done a lot of research on journalism, American politics, various forms of activism, and also comparative work in Western Europe and elsewhere. His recent books include Ground Wars, Personalized Communication and Political Campaigns, and Political Journalism in Transition, Western Europe in a Comparative Perspective. Ground Wars actually won the APSA Doris Graber Award for the best book on political communication published in the prior 10 years. Today, Professor Nielsen is going to speak to us on News You Don't Believe, user perspectives on fake news and misinformation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, and to you and the co-organizers for the invitation to join today. It's delightful to see both some good friends on the call, you, Helen Bowden and Michael Schutzen and others, and also lots of people I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. So I look forward to this. If I could ask for screen sharing, I'll start showing some slides.
Oh, sorry, I thought we had already done that. Just a moment. Participants. Oh, there you are. More. Okay, you should be able to do it now.
That's great, thank you. I just get a confirmation that you can see my slides now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so really, I suppose the starting point today for me is as a social scientist, but I'll also say a few things about work I do that go a little bit beyond my research interests. So I have the privilege of serving as director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, where our mission is to connect practice and research around the issues facing journalists and news media across the world. And as part of that, of course, we do social science research and try to bring evidence to these issues. But we also prioritize trying to make sure that we connect this work with the concerns that journalists and news media face around the world, as well as organizations that are sort of adjacent with or overlapping with journalism and news media, including policy work. So in addition to my scholarly work, I've also had various involvements with public policy. So for example, I served on the European Commission's rather grandly named high-level expert group on online disinformation in 2018. And I've been quite involved in some of these discussions in an advisory capacity in terms of offering, research input to different governments and other entities who are trying to make decisions in this space, because I fundamentally believe that social science has a really important role in trying to inform some of these decisions in public, but also the ones that policymakers make around the world. And the reason why I say this is that at the outset will become, I hope, clear along the way. The starting point really in terms of the research side of this presentation is this idea of public perspectives on quote unquote fake news and misinformation. And I suppose that the theoretical premise here is very simple. It is that any social or political phenomenon is at least in part about perception, and thus it matters that we pay attention to how the public thinks about, perceives, and interprets things that we're interested in. And that's a very sort of researchery thing to say, if you will. And we could probably talk about social construction from now till the cows come home, and we'd have a swell time, but that's not really the direction that I wanted to take this in. It's really more a different kind of point that I would like to make, which is that if we think about connecting misinformation research and practice, which, as said, I think is part of the mission of the work we do at the Reuters Institute, and I know many others who join this lecture series and does important work in this space as practitioners and researchers are thinking about, we obviously have a research component. What do we know, and how can we find out? Then we have, I think, a policy dimension to this. What kinds of collectively binding decisions can be made in this kind of space, and also, of course, private forms of governance, as we are seeing very visibly today. But also, as said, I think a dimension about this that is about the public, if you will. What is the public perception of a set of issues? What is their understanding of it? And what are their preferences really about how we might approach it? In this sense, I think misinformation is an issue that cuts across all these different sort of worlds, if you will, worlds of work, research, policy, and the public. And like many other important issues of our time, whether we're thinking about climate change or migration or criminal justice or education or voting, it matters what we know about these things as researchers, but it sure as hell also matters what policymakers think they know and what they decide to do and what the public thinks it knows and what it decides to do. So I'm interested, if you will, in this intersection of this Venn diagram. Now, I care about it because I think it's substantially important, but I also care about it as a researcher. I'm quite inspired by the work of Helga Novotny, a European sociologist of science and also previously president of the European Research Council, who's written about what she calls socially robust knowledge, and the idea that in addition to the reliability, validity, and reproducibility that we associate with all scientific knowledge, there are areas of our work where we might aspire to something that goes beyond that reliability and also embrace a notion of what she calls robustness. Namely through discussions and engagement with stakeholders, both members of the public and more professionalized stakeholders, we aim to arrive at knowledge that is not only reliable, though that is essential for it to qualify as knowledge, but also is relevant and accepted by actors in the context of its application, as she writes in an article from 2003. So this, if you will, is something I'm interested in, is what would socially robust knowledge look like in the area of misinformation? And what I want to do today is to bring some evidence to bear from some work that I've been doing in recent years with colleagues at the Reuters Institute that try to get at the public understanding of this. But I want to use it to try to drive a conversation towards what might socially robust knowledge look like in this space, something that creates a sense of commonality and a shared understanding, perhaps, even if there can also, of course, be entirely legitimate differences between researchers, policymakers, and members of the public. So I want to start with a way of sort of thinking about the broader field here of misinformation research. And obviously, you had in this series some outstanding researchers who offer different perspectives in this. Before I dive into what I hope we can bring to this from the teamwork we do at the Reuters Institute, I want to sort of position this in terms of sort of a way of thinking about misinformation research and where I think we are. Like all maps, the map I'm about to draw for you is sort of two-dimensional and will hopefully provide some orientation, but also necessarily a simplification and even elision of some important things. But nonetheless, bear with me for a minute while I explain, the map I'm about to show you. I think every serious researcher I know in this area will sort of start with platforms when thinking about misinformation research today, and would think of platforms as part and parcel of the misinformation problems that we face in our societies. I think there are some differences of interpretation in terms of sort of how large a part of the problems of misinformation that we face platforms specifically are amongst researchers, but I don't know any serious researchers who would challenge the idea that they are at the heart of these matters, both to understand and in terms of having to answer for them. Now, I'll set aside for a minute here sort of historical ways of thinking about where we are with misinformation and how we might think of our sort of current predicaments, if you will. And I don't set that aside because I don't think it matters. I think in some ways it matters very greatly whether one is thinking about the way in which sort of racist theories have figured in public discourse historically, advanced also by elites and news media, or whether one thinks about sexism and homophobia, or for that matter, just the question of whether in my adult lifetime, the most consequential misinformation may have been, for example, the false balance applied to human-induced climate change, or the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, or similar issues like that, that I think we haven't really sort of contented with when people resort to easy periodization such as post-truth or the like, as many important scholars have pointed out. So set aside for a minute just history and try to first think about the present stage, where I think we might think about where we are with misinformation research, and offer sort of two dimensions of thinking about the work that we do and how we interpret the situation that we're in. One is a dimension that I think spans a continuum from scholars who prefer relatively narrow definitions of what is sort of counted as constituting misinformation, essentially primarily as sort of identified domains, often identified on the basis of the work of professional fact checkers or various websites that offer ratings of the credibility based on more or less transparent methodologies, versus scholars who prefer a broader definition of the problems that we face, such as a quite inclusive phrase like problematic information that goes well beyond more narrow definitions of these problems. So this is one dimension. And then I think another one is an interpretation of where one thinks the relative center of gravity is between top-down drivers of misinformation, domestic politicians, media, foreign governments, versus a greater emphasis on sort of bottom-up activities, whether they are activists or groups who sometimes deliberately engage in spreading misinformation, sometimes in more ambiguous ways engage in spreading it, or ordinary people who sometimes in good faith will spread things that are in fact false or misleading. This is sort of a way, I think, of thinking about where we are with misinformation research, and those of you on the call who have followed the seminar series can sort of think about some of the scholars who presented in the past and where they might be in this. There are scholars who've done very impressive work that looks at identified domains with a relatively narrow definition and identifies a relatively large role for some media organizations. And there are others who take a much broader conception and focus on activist groups and the like. So I think we can sort of think about different works of scholarship or even sort of individual scholars' interpretation of where we are in a map like this. And people will also, as said, all be thinking about platforms, but perhaps with different levels of emphasis about the centrality of platforms collectively or any one individual platform on this. But how does the public think about misinformation? This is what I want to turn to now, based on some of the evidence we've collected over the years at the Reuters Institute, and I'll return to how this ties in with the ambition to connect practice and research and produce socially robust knowledge and the map that I just offered up to you. But first, I want to highlight some pieces of evidence from work that we have done at the Reuters Institute. And in the sort of spirit of quantitative description, which I wholeheartedly embrace, that Andy Guess and Kevin Munger and Esther Hargitay have been very eloquent champions on for recently, this is not going to be very sophisticated causal analysis, but essentially descriptive to give you some sense from both quantitative and qualitative work of how our research suggests that the public think about problems of misinformation. The top line here is that a lot of people are very worried about this. These are just the percentages of respondents in the most recent edition of our annual Reuters Institute Digital News Report, and a survey of internet news users across the world in 40 markets in 2020, who answer that they are very or extremely concerned about whether online news they come across is real or fake. So on average, across these 40 markets, more than half say that they're extremely aware and concerned about this. And in some markets like the US, it's 2/3, even higher in a few other markets. So very, very widespread concern in many countries, even if there are a few mostly sort of Nordic or Northern European countries with much lower levels of concern. Even there, it's still 1/3 or more of the public who say that they are very or extremely concerned about whether the online news they come across on the internet is real or fake. So very, very widespread public concern in many countries. But what does this actually mean to people? I mean, I've been curious about this for a long time. And again, I think if we sort of ask the question of, what does fake news mean? It's again a sort of an area where it'd be delightful to go down a sort of a terminological rabbit hole collectively, all of us on this call, and discuss various philosophical definitions or theoretical definitions. But I suppose my instinct normally is that I'm interested in finding out how people think about something. I go and ask them. So what we did back in 2017 at the sort of relatively early stages of this discussion is that we ran focus groups in 4 different countries, the US, the UK, Spain, and Finland, 2 focus groups in each. And as part of those focus group discussions, we asked people to explain what the term fake news meant to them. And I will offer here some inductively arrived at categorizations of the examples that people offered in those focus groups. Quite a lot of people would say, well, satire. I mean, this, of course, also was the original scholarly treatment of fake news, was often focused on satire, but it's not really seen as news. So people sort of mention it, but quickly dismiss it. Then you have, quite shocking for journalists, poor journalism. And people very quickly jump to the conclusion that quote unquote fake news meant superficial, inaccurate, and or sensationalist journalism by professional journalists working at news organizations. Of course, parenthetically, this is one of the reasons why the term should be avoided like the plague, because it sort of suggests a different kind of problem from the one that scholars are often primarily interested in, hence my own preference for the term misinformation. Then you have political propaganda, if you will, either from pundits or politicians. So politicians who lie, extreme forms of spin, and hyper-partisan opinion content from various sort of media personalities, if you will. Then you have some forms of advertising. These are often the sort of around the web type links at the bottom of news articles. People would say, well, that's also fake news because it looks like news, but it really isn't. It's something else entirely. And this, of course, is also quite troubling for media organizations to be confronted with, that this is sort of part of what the folk theories, if you will, of misinformation look like, at least for some people. And then finally, we arrive at sort of what I suppose was the classic focus initially, sort of false news, things that are fabricated, whether for profit or politically motivated, and various malicious hoaxes. This, I think, has been the sort of the central focus of a lot of sort of scholarly attention, rightly so. This is very important. But it's also interesting that, again, in the focus group discussions, people would say, well, these things exist, but they would also say it's not news. So that's not what fake news means to me. So instead, what we end up with is a situation where people identify fake news as a difference of degree, not a categorical distinction between news and fake news, and primarily in the focus group discussions associated with poor journalism, propaganda, and some forms of advertising, whereas the kinds of sort of false and fabricated information many scholars were interested in is sort of not really considered news at all, so thought about as different from this, and satire, which many scholars were previously interested in as fake news, is also sort of set aside perhaps more reasonably. Now, this is qualitative work, and I think this can only really help us get at the sort of nuance of different ways in which the public think about these issues. It's something else entirely to try to get a sense of what public opinion is at a population level. So we try to build off of these focus groups, which we did in 2017. In 2018, in the Digital News Report, we designed a set of survey questions to try to understand public perceived concern and exposure to these different kinds of misinformation. And what we found, this is just an average across the Digital News Report, which at that year had 37 markets. Our slightly imperial expansion was not quite at the level that it is at today at the time, of the percentage of respondents who say that they are concerned about a certain kind of sort of misinformation problem. And then below that, the percentage of people say that they personally have seen it, come across it in the last week. And what I think we see here, sort of broadly speaking, is sort of two things. Again, high levels of concern. Between a quarter and more than half say that they are concerned about all these different types. It's really, I think, worth noting that the concern is quite focused on political propaganda, fabricated information, yes, or content, yes, but also poor journalism. And then when we turn to what people say they themselves have been exposed to actually come across, the concern really is focused on political propaganda and poor journalism, what people see as examples of poor journalism. This gives us a sense, I think, at least of what in 2018 across these markets, what public perception was of misinformation problems and their scale and scope and severity. And I suppose the sort of the one-line summary of it was that people are very worried. They see the problems as very complex, quite pervasive, and largely driven by journalists and politicians, even if they also are very concerned about what they come across online. Now, that's all very complicated. And I suppose we wanted to see if we could sort of get a little bit more clarity, if you will, if we structured questions in a way where people had to sort of pick something that they were most worried about. It's interesting to know that everyone seems to be, or most people seem to be worried about lots of things, but what are they most worried about? So in 2020, in the Digital News Report, what we decided to do was to ask a set of questions around what sources of false and misleading information, to use that sort of classic definition of misinformation, people were most concerned about, and what platforms where they might come across false and misleading information they were most concerned about. And again, I will just show the top line results here and a few national and political breakdowns. First, in terms of sources, more people are concerned about false and misleading information from politicians than any other source across the 40 countries we covered in the report last year. There is sizable minority that's concerned about activists, that's concerned about journalists, concerned about ordinary people or foreign governments, the sort of information operations that again were a classic focus early on, but really a large plurality are focused about domestic politicians as the source that they say they're most concerned about false or misleading information from. If we turn then from sources to platforms, the picture, let me just share this first, Of course, there is no consensus on this often. So, most of you will be familiar with the situation in the United States. When we look at the political breakdown between respondents who identify as being politically on the left and respondents who identify as being politically on the right, in terms of what source they're most concerned about, on the left, last year, the concern was focused on domestic politicians and parties, very low concern about journalists and news organizations on the left last year. On the right, some concern about domestic politicians and parties, very high concern, almost half, or more than 4 in 10 of our right-wing respondents say that they were most concerned about false or misleading information from journalists and news organizations. This is not an entirely universal pattern, so I'll just show the data from the UK. Very sort of similar high levels of concern about domestic politicians from people on the left, much lower concern from people on the right, who also happens to be supporting the party in government. And some difference between journalists and news organizations, but much lower level of concern in the UK about that. If we turn then from sources to platforms, this is the overall pattern that we see. More people are concerned about Facebook than any other platform. When we average across all 40 countries, there are some variation, but Facebook comes out number one in this unedifying poll or poll question in most of the markets that we look at. And of course, if one looks at sort of Facebook corporate, because the two messaging app queues we give people is WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. In fact, it's 43% of respondents, so even inching ahead of domestic politicians in terms of overall level of concern, who identifies sort of Facebook corporate as the platforms they're most concerned about misinformation from. But news websites or apps actually come in second, 22%. Identify news websites or apps as the platform they're most concerned about coming across false and misleading information on. ahead of search, ahead of YouTube, which is quite shocking, I think personally, and ahead of Twitter as well, which of course in part is because Twitter has fewer users. Now, again, I'll just quickly show some left-right breakdowns of this. In the United States, last year, the survey was in the field in January, February 2020. On the left, much higher levels of concern about false and misleading information from Facebook, much lower on the right, but still considerable. And news websites or apps, much lower levels of concern from the left, much higher on the right. Again, patterns are not entirely universal, but not so different in the UK. Higher level of concern about Facebook on the left, lower on the right, and about the same concern on the left and the right about false and misleading information from news websites or apps, about a quarter of respondents. So where does that leave us in terms of the sort of map I offered at the outset and the idea of connecting research, policy, and public understanding of these issues? Well, let me sort of return to the map first. I suppose one way to summarize the sort of descriptive empirical findings of these last years of work that we have done at the Reuters Institute is that for much of the public, if we want to sort of map where the center of gravity is of the public understanding of misinformation problems, I would put to you that our work suggests that much of the public is primarily concerned with top-down misinformation, broadly conceived, and concern is focused on Facebook, both sort of Big Blue and Facebook-owned properties, such as WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. They're concerned about domestic politicians, and a large minority are concerned about journalism and news media as sources or platforms of false and misleading information. But also importantly, there is no clear public consensus on several of these issues. There are very significant partisan differences, for example, between people on the left and the right, and other differences of public sort of perception of these issues that can be quite divisive. Now, how do policymakers think about this? I'm not going to offer here sort of an empirical analysis of how policymakers in different countries think about this, but I'll just offer a sort of a personal, impressionistic, if you will, summary of the way I, as a sort of observer of this and sometimes interlocutor of it, see the sort of main thrust of policy discussions in the European Union around this. And I would suggest that it is sort of largely in this corner. The policy concern in the European Union, it seems to me, is often focused on Facebook and others who are sort of called in front of sort of hearings of various sorts and are asked to do things, rightly so from my personal point of view, but that's a separate matter. But there is a striking absence of policy interest in the question of whether there might be top-down problems with misinformation originating with domestic politicians or domestic journalists and news media. The primary policy focus on top-down misinformation, seems to me, is focused on information operations for foreign states. But there is, it seems to me, little, if any, alignment between public understanding of the core of many misinformation problems as emanating from domestic politicians and domestic news media, and then the way in which policymakers discuss these issues and are planning to address them. So this is sort of a way, I think, of sort of mapping our research into public understanding and at least suggesting where policy understandings might be in the case of the European Union. And I'll not hazard summarizing very rich and rapidly evolving scholarly consensus in this, because I think there are some things we agree on, such as the centrality of platforms, but other things that reasonable people can disagree on and will interpret in different ways. And we, of course, are rightly quite sort of contrarian and in some ways competitive in the best possible sense of that word when we sort of work on these things as scholars. And the only thing I'll say is that I wish we had as much empirical work on which to base both a sort of a research consensus and a sense of sort of legitimate differences of interpretation and opinion in the European Union and beyond as exists in the United States. And I hope, of course, we get there over time. But the final thing I want to sort of end with really is my sort of Venn diagram, if you will. And it's just to say that if we think about this from the point of view of at least thinking about what, if any, overlap might exist between these different spheres of activity, and whether we can arrive at some understanding that ideally is sort of reliable, valid, and reproducible knowledge from a scientific point of view, but also has an element of social robustness, a sense of being accepted and relevant in the context of its application, as Helge Novotny put it, and might provide the basis of responding to misinformation problems in a way that is evidence-based and commands broad-based both policy and public support. What might this look like? I mean, essentially, I suppose my question is, can we get here? Can we get to a place where there is a sense of commonality or overlap between the research understanding of these issues, the policy understanding of these issues, and public understanding of these issues? And I think it matters. Part of this is essentially a social scientific empirical question, do these things overlap? That's a research question, or a set of research questions, if you will. But it seems to me it also matters substantially in the sense that, as many sociologists and other social scientists have pointed out over the years, social science and sort of social understandings of society have a way of falling back on themselves and becoming sort of social facts in themselves. And the same way that it seems to me that we can't really hope to arrive at responses to, say, problems represented by human-induced climate change, or the challenges and opportunities that come with migration, or issues around criminal justice, or for that matter, questions of how we design educational systems or voting systems that are both effective and credible, unless we can hope for some form of overlap between these different worlds. Now, I think what follows from that is something that's a little bit sort of perhaps uncomfortable for us to think about, or those of us who are primarily think of ourselves as sort of pursuing a sort of science as a vocation, is, if our understanding, whether there is high degree of scientific consensus or our own individual interpretation as scientists of what we believe to be the most persuasive interpretation of the best available evidence, is not aligned with policymakers' priorities, or for that matter, with a public understanding of these issues, what do we do then? Is that a situation where we simply sort of step away and say, well, that's their problem, and if there is a disconnect, that's for someone else to think about? Or is there a moment in which we engage, as I'm full of admiration for the many previous speakers who have appeared in the series and many other scholars who do engage and prioritize that in a situation where their universities might often want them to just teach more things and publish more peer-reviewed stuff and secure more grants, that people take out time, often a second shift, those who have the privileges in their working hours to as I do from a privileged position here in Oxford, prioritize actually trying to arrive at some sort of overlap here, not because scientists, can or should dictate either policymaking or public understanding, but perhaps because we have some role in trying to inform it and offer some understanding. And if we can't get there, should we get there? But what if we can't get there? I suppose then, in some ways, we end with a question that science has no answer to, but that's, many of us will face as sort of citizens or people who seek to offer some form of engagement with public life, which is that, what do we do then? Is there a moment where one will have to sort of make a set of decisions about the relative virtues beyond the purely scientific of different ways of prioritizing these overlaps? Is there a moment at which one says, well, even if there is no broad-based policy support or public support, if a set of research findings suggests a certain interpretation of the problem and a certain set of solutions, then we should just do it, if you will, a form of decisive unilateral technocracy, or sort of the hope that the powers that be will listen to an interpretation of these problems, even if there is no broad-based political or public support for that interpretation, which would have the great virtue of enabling decisive action, but of course carry with it the risk of further undermining the credibility of any response that might alienate many political actors and many members of the public? Or is there a different position that is possible, which is that of, which I suppose betrays my geographic roots as a European, of sort of boring, unhappy compromise, where one prioritizes the importance of social robustness and broad-based political and public support for responses that should also be evidence-based, but do need something more to be not just effective, but also credible. The way that one might think, for example, as a scientist, that perhaps there are more ideal electoral systems in the world, there very well might be, than the one happens to live with. But one may not want every new majority or every new administration to institute its own favorite form of electoral system, because there is a risk, perhaps, that comes with politicizing the process itself. And it seems to me that this is sort of one of the challenges we have to navigate, each of us individually, as we engage in this, as scholars of misinformation, but also for those who prioritize and have the privilege to engage in policy and public discussion around these issues. And with that, I will wrap it up, and I look forward to the discussion and to questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rasmus. So we're going to use the usual process for Q&A. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or you can type it in the chat, and we'll sort of go back and forth depending on where the questions are. While I'm waiting for people to think of questions, maybe I'll steal the floor like I've done a couple of times before, take advantage of the fact that my speaker's on, and ask the first question. Looking at your Venn diagram, the one thing that troubles me about that is you have a circle for the public, yet the data you're showing us suggests that we don't have a public. We have several publics who have an utterly different idea of the way the world is and where the problem is. And this was, at least to me, a little bit surprising extent, similar in the UK and the US. I don't know about, in your broader search. So, can you really do the things that you're talking about doing realistically without sort of finding a bridge between these two seemingly utterly contradictory and distinct views of, what the way the world is and the nature of this problem? So, forgive me for sort of painting it in stark.
No, thanks, Matt. Look, I mean, I think I wrestle with that every day, because I think that's that's the question that each of us will have to sort of walk through. And it's one of the reasons I, designed the talk the way I did, is I am undecided about this at an individual level. And I don't have a sort of a programmatic vision of what I think we all ought to do as scientists. I'm not here to tell anyone what to think or what to do. I suppose that I'm thinking about, for myself, as I try to do when I talk to policymakers, about what might the consequences be of different ways of approaching this. And it seems to me that there are sort of really only sort of three ideal typical ways ahead here. One is the sort of the hardest and most uncertain, which is to believe in the possibility of building a broader shared understanding of these issues, even in countries where many people disagree vigorously about many other things. Now, that might seem like a sort of a delusional, acid trip from the point of view of many, given the times that we live in. But I think it's worth just remembering that there are institutions in society who command broad political and public support. In Europe, public service media being one of them, despite the sort of large number of loudmouths who suggest that no one trusts the BBC. The BBC is by far the most widely used and highly and broadly trusted source of news in the UK, no matter how many people make their living claiming otherwise. So, that is something, but I also want to recognize that is sort of the hard and slow boring of both political and public boards, if you will, and there are no guarantees that we can build a social contract around these things. So if one doesn't sort of want to embark on that uncertain and perhaps unsuccessful endeavor, I think there are really only two other options left. One is a sort of a consciously and deliberately partisan approach, which is to say, this is what I think is true and right, and we will do it if we get the opportunity. And I think that's a legitimate position to hold. I think one should be honest enough to recognize that it will almost certainly further exacerbate social divisions over the issue of sort of trust and credibility of our information environment, and whether one sort of thinks that what can be gained by doing it outweighs the possible costs of even further eroding low trust and confidence in our information environment. You know, that's a judgment call, and I can see the value of it because we face very serious problems, and decisive action may require a partisan stance, but I think there are real risks. The other is to say, well, you know, what is the lowest common denominator? The lowest common denominator is a very unhappy place to be, and it's probably the status quo. And I can absolutely understand that there are many people who would say the status quo is not acceptable, and it's certainly not acceptable for some communities who are the receiving end of more misinformation than others, or more harassment and online hate than others. But I would only just say, and I say this having sort of read through 46 country profiles for our 2021 digital news report, looked at some of the things governments are doing around the world. As a social scientist, I should just remind people who hope for the better that things can always get worse. And that there are no guarantees that you know, the steps taken by policymakers are the ones that one might hope for. And I would, at an individual level, feel very sorry if we replaced an unbecoming naivete about private companies in this space with a frankly naive interpretation of the sort of the goodwill and high principles of all policymakers all the time. So I think these are the choices, you know, that we face.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions now from the floor. So Russ Newman.
Rasmus, first of all, congratulations on another great presentation and a wonderful call for reviewing the agenda for research in this area. And I wanted to suggest a dimension that you hadn't emphasized, but I think ought to be included on the research topics, which is the profitability of conspiratorial and extreme news. We have this sense that the American story is that Roger Ailes sort of discovered that, hey, there's a gold mine here in highly partisan news. It's sort of the rediscovery of the yellow journalism of the 19th century in the American case. Is there I'm not aware of a dimension of research on the question of the relative profitability of distorted, highly partisan news. Is there some work on that area?
Thanks, Russ. I agree. I think this is super important, the political economy of these issues. You know, I think there is a little bit of work done, you know, for example, Sarah Silberraj and Jeff Berry's book, The Outrage Industry, that looks back at the sort of incarnations of this that you allude to with Fox News in the United States, which of course is hugely profitable.
But that's 10 years old.
But that's 10 years old. And there is work, I would say, probably more in, a lot of it is sort of in policy/advocacy circles around the monetization of misinformation on platforms, the use of, say, Google's ad tech suite, distribution on Facebook and the like for commercially motivated misinformation. Scholarly work in that area. There is one article I know of in the inaugural issue of the Journal of Quantitative Media Description that deals with this, and some, you know, papers in sort of computer science fields, but I think it's pretty nascent, I have to say, in this area, and I completely agree. I think we need to look at incentives, and some of them are about power, but it's very clear that other are just money. If there are any women who want to have that, I find the dynamics better if it's a bit mixed. So I would love to hear a question from Robert and others, but it'll be great.
So we have questions in the chat. Jennifer Preston asks, in the survey, did respondents get a chance to share different opinions on national news media and local news media?
Thanks, Jennifer. Not in the misinformation questions. We do find more broadly that when we ask questions around trust, for example, that in almost every market, local news organizations are more highly and broadly trusted than national ones. And also that trust in them is less polarized along political lines than national ones. And I think we can all sort of understand some of the possible drivers of this, in part as sort of a license to be champions of a place rather than critics is something that many members of the public often ask from news organizations. Local media, I think, have sort of embraced that role a bit more than national. And the other, I suppose, just what a charitable interpretation is sort of neutrality, and a less charitable interpretation, the risk of false balance of news organizations that have very clear commercial motives for serving everybody in a single community, and thus rarely sort of veers off in directions that someone might find polarizing, even if it happens to be true and right. So.
Thank you.
Okay, Heike Rafael Hernandez.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'm a professor of American Studies, and I'm actually in Germany at the University of Würzburg. And so thank you so much for this talk. I just have a short question, and perhaps you had it somehow addressed, but I didn't catch it. I mean, the research you presented was about perception, so that like in a different country, so the public, how the left or the right perceive that, and then you talked about policies and policy makers, but isn't that so that this doesn't even go together? If I have this perception, it doesn't matter what the policy will be, because if you want to change my perception, I think it takes something different than to have certain policies being changed. Do you understand what I mean? Like, perception stays there and probably doesn't go away with some of the ideas you offered.
Thanks, Heike. Thanks very much for offering an opportunity for trying to clarify that. I mean, I suppose I'm thinking of by analogy here. I think it in part it matters substantially, I think, to understand both quantitatively and qualitatively public opinion and folk theories of things that matter in the world. I think this has sort of discrete intrinsic importance to figure out how people understand the world and how they see it. But the part of it that's about the overlap between research, policy, and public perception, I would sort of reason by analogy and say, if we think about an issue such as human-induced climate change, it seems to me to matter substantially whether there is an overlap between a research consensus, we are living in an age of unprecedented human-induced climate change, a policy perception that elected officials and other powerful individuals in the political system share this view, and a public perception that the public at large shares this view, or whether we live in a society or a world in which there is no such alignment, or where parts of the public and parts of policymakers and parts of the research community are aligned, but there are large minorities who take very different positions in these issues. Of course, climate change would be an example of that. And it's not alone in it. I mean, I suppose, having been sort of through quite a lot of these discussions in a personal capacity over what feels like 500 years, but really is only sort of 5 years or so in recent years, I suppose have a renewed admiration for colleagues who work on, say, criminal justice, and who have for decades, I think, had to navigate terrains where there are very polarizing public and policy perceptions. Some scholarly disagreement, but also, I think, often a very significant distance between policy thinking and public thinking on criminal justice and what actual research suggests might work in terms of, say, whether jail is a meaningful, policy to respond, sort of to achieve what the purported goals of locking people up are, or not. And it seems to me that it sort of matters whether these things are aligned. Is that helpful?
kind of. I don't know, like I'm a lot of my research is actually in what you just said. You know, like Black Lives Matters in America, and I think I'm not sure whether that changes something for certain groups. That because for them their perception is already there in place, and you can do whatever you want to. My perception doesn't go away. Then, but I don't want to monopolize.
No, I mean, look, I mean, I think that's fair, and that's also why I ended on that sort of note of uncertainty, in the sense that, you know, I'm a sort of a small D Democrat, if you will, and I don't believe. I mean, I suppose my personal view is that these things are sort of democratic decisions, but I would also say that, of course, there are things in which, you know, whether something is true and whether something is right in a moral sense is not always a matter of sort of a show of hands. It's not always a majoritarian issue, and there are which I would take a very strong stance individually, even if there was no consensus or even research to back it up.
I'd love to get a few more people in, if that's okay. So we are now going back to the chat. Alaker Peltonen, apologies if I mispronounced. Is there any data you've come across about the public's assignment of responsibility, if any, on the part of platform executives, i.e. Zuckerberg, to control or regulate misinformation?
Thanks, Alaker. I actually, because I sort of didn't think through my notes, I skipped the slide that we have from 2018 that I can just sort of show now very briefly on what the situation was at the time in terms of, you know, who people, at least in our survey in 2018, said they felt should do something about these problems. And essentially, it's basically everyone. I mean, the first number that 75% of the respondents say that they feel publishers should do more to make it easier to separate what's real and fake on the internet is a bit shocking for news media, who broadly, I think, often think of this as sort of somebody else's problem, though that's not the way the public thinks about it, and sees themselves as sort of the solution and not part of the problem, though the public, parts of the public will beg to differ in that. Very high level of I think, legitimate and understandable focus on the responsibilities and shortcomings of platforms. And then the question of whether government should do anything, that varies a lot by market, in sort of broadly in line with what you might expect. Limited appetite for government intervention in this space in the United States, higher in Europe, in the European Union. So, you know, I think it's sort of often there is a risk that describing something as sort of not just a sort of as describing something as a sort of an all of society problem can risk diluting responsibility and deflecting attention away from the fact that we're not all equally responsible, and there are very good reasons to focusing on the particular responsibilities of large, powerful, profitable private companies, as well as powerful governments and politicians, whether as purveyors of misinformation or as having conspicuously not responded to it. I could talk separately about that if we had another hour about all the things we recommended that was never been done by anyone, but you know, that's a separate matter. But I would say that sort of broadly our research suggests that amongst other actors, there is very great public appetite for platform companies to do more, much more than what they're doing now. Whether that will always make everybody happy, well, I suppose the discussion we're having today about Mr. Trump and whether he should stay or he should go suggests that these are very polarizing issues and that there may not be ways of making everybody happy.
Robert Walker.
Hi, I'm simultaneously at Shorenstein, at Oxford and at Beijing, which is where I'm speaking from. Rasmus, back to GTC in some senses and conversations we've previously had. But can I ask a question and then offer a reflection? The question is whether in your research to date, you've learned, understood, asked questions about how people make a distinction between information and misinformation, and whether misinformation is merely just something which doesn't quite match my belief. It's a departure from the way that I understand the world. And I ask that and connect that to the observation. Your final Venn diagram It's a Venn diagram that we use very often in social policy, those of us who are trying to engage with the policy making process. And the intersection at the centre, the sort of sweet spot that we would all like to be. I think when I began research, I prioritised evidence in that spot. But the longer I worked within the policy domain, the more I realised that ideology is central to that central spot. It's what policymakers think first, and then subsequently seek evidence to support more often, I guess, than to challenge. And that one often ends up in research with a request to effectively, to evaluate the effectiveness of ideology. And that becomes part of a research process, which is clearly impossible. But I think that connection is the one I would want to make. But do we know how people define misinformation?
Thanks, Robert. I mean, I'm with you. I think I sort of, I suppose I like to sort of pretend I'm a realist, but I'm a naive too often for my own good. I agree with you. I think the truth of the matter is probably there is more policy-based evidence making than there is evidence-based policy making, and that may just be the way it is. But I suppose that I have chosen to become a scientist, in part because I think science is intrinsically important, but also because I hope that sometimes perhaps it can play a role beyond the confines of the institutions that we are part of. On your first question about definitions of misinformation, I mean, I don't want to be sort of I don't want to overrate this pudding and sort of get on a soapbox and style myself as sort of a populist sociologist that claims that sort of public judgment is always nuanced and unerring. But I would say that, you know, I think our research often suggests that much of the public has a far more nuanced and robust understanding of many issues around news and journalism, media and misinformation than some commentators give them credit for. And that there is a sort of, I think there is a sort of a risk sometimes of, in the desire to avoid naive optimism, to collapse into naive pessimism that can very easily become sort of condescending towards individuals' ability to navigate the world in a fairly sensible way. And I would just say that, you know, if I were to sort of summarize our focus group discussions impossibly in a single sentence, I would say that many of the people who took part of those focus group in 2017, their way of thinking around problems of misinformation were not so different from the Hutchins Commission's observation that things can be factually accurate yet substantially untrue. And I think that's pretty sensible, whether it's in the Hutchins Commission or from the words of people in focus groups. I'm not saying everyone is, and I'm not saying that all of us are all the time well-equipped to deal with all these things or thinking about it with sort of the depth and nuance of some blue ribbon commission at the University of Chicago a long time ago. I would just say that, and I'm not suggesting you are doing this, but I would say that there are, I think, pundits and policymakers in this space, and perhaps also on occasion, some academics who I think sort of jump to unwarranted conclusions about the supposed shortcomings of the public. And I would just say that in that case, as with any other case, that great claims require great evidence. And if we claim that everyone is a naive idiot, then we should have the facts to back it up. And I don't feel we have.
Okay, on that note, we're a little bit in overtime, so I feel like I have to bring it to a close. I'm sorry we couldn't quite get to everybody's questions, but I want to ask everybody to join me in thanking Professor Nielsen for a really terrific talk and a great way to end our season. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Take care.